Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you, based on wherever you are from, where are you based. Uh, Thank you all for joining for today's program, and welcome to this new webinar series on demographic economics hosted by YSI South Asia. Today, we have a perfect plenary or a perfect inauguratory speaker for this webinar series on demographic economics in Professor K.S. James. Professor K.S. James is currently at Newcomb University, Newcomb Institute at Tulane University, and he doesn't really need an introduction, but it's my privilege to introduce him to all of you. So he's formerly the director and senior professor at International Institute for Population Studies. He's also served as professor of population studies at JNU New Delhi and professor and head of Population Research Center at Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. Uh, Currently, he holds the position as Vice President of the Asian Population Association and serves as the member of the commission set up by Government of Kerala to formulate Kerala's urban policy. He has a postdoctoral training from Harvard University and a PhD from JNU. He's been visiting several international reputed universities and institutes, including Harvard University, London School of Economics, EASA in Austria, University of Southampton, and University of Groningen. Broadly, his works are interact with population dynamics, and he investigates India's demographic changes and its implications on economy and society. Much of his research work aims at improving the empirical knowledge of the determinants and consequences of demographic change in India. His works on demographic changes and dividend are widely recognized as important contribution to understanding new forms of demographic change. He has numerous articles and books to his credit, including his publication in the prestigious Science Journal, and examining the quality of data available from registration and administrative system, as well as from surveys, forms a major focus of his work in recent years. And he's very popular among students, and he's also an icon of academic and data integrity. So welcome to Young Scholars Initiative, Professor, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vikram and Arun, for this kind invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be with young scholars, because young scholars are who will give an idea, because all of us who are really relatively old is always playing with whatever we heard, the ideas in the past. So I always like to interact with young scholars. And, not only that you have ideas, you have also the enthusiasm to take forward those ideas for the further development. So that way, it's a pleasure to be among all of you. And also, I'm really happy, and also thank you for inviting me to give this lecture for the first talk in the series on South Asian demography and economics interaction. I know it is a very important topic, but what perhaps I am going to do today, I'm not going to give any really new ideas on this. I am really going to discuss what has been actually at the realm of debates and discussion on demographic change and equity. And perhaps look at how do you really understand these concepts? Because, there are classical ways of understanding it. And if you're an economist and you have, the classical ways of understanding it. So perhaps I only want to look at whether the classical way of understanding this relationship, demographic change and equity, can really give adequate dividend. That is what. But, I'm taking a specific example of demographic dividend. This is applicable to anything, any of the issues which we are confronting because of the demographic changes. Give me 1 minute. Let me open the slides. I hope it's visible.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So that is although the title is demographic dividend, this is actually the case with any of the issues which we confront because of the demographic changes. So is not limited to demographic dividend, but I will also perhaps touch upon some of the other issues, but in case the time permits. But otherwise, today I will primarily concentrate on the dividend. What are the major questions which can arise? The obvious question is that is inequity comes down systematically with the demographic changes? That is what anyone can ask these questions. I know as an economic student, if you are any social science students, I don't think that this question is difficult to understand because we have a long years of teaching as well as, making people aware that the population growth is always bad. So naturally, that can lead to poverty, inequity, all those things we have studied in the textbooks. So naturally, I think this is a question comes to everyone's mind. Is inequity comes down systematically with the demographic change? But it is also important to ask the second question then. If it comes down, it can comes down the classical things which we understood, but are there any new forms of inequity emerge with the fertility transition? That is also another important question we need to really ask this question. And if that is so, what is the sort of inequity that can arise? So there are large amount of inequity people have really talked about. People have already talked about because of the demographic transition and the second demographic changes, you have the family level inequities within family because of all kinds of changes which is happening. I'm not really looking at those very micro aspects of inequity. I'm really asking at the broader level, what forms of inequity that can emerge along with the fertility transition. And finally, if you think that, either it is coming down or it's a new forms of inequity emerges, then how do you understand the equity and how do you really account for it or how do you measure it? All those things definitely comes. I know being a demographer, always measurement is most important for us. So naturally, if you really know that there is inequity, then we need to really understand it. We need to measure it. We need to really see how actually it is moving. All these are important. The question then is whether the classical understanding of the measures and methods, is it really sufficient to really unpack these problems? So that could be the third issue. So, but I'm not really going to discuss all these things today. That's what I told you. I am only just giving one examples of demographic dividend and then see perhaps what is the way to really look at these issues to understand the equity aspects. That's what I'll be doing today, my lecture. So I'm not really going to have much of estimation of anything. It's all basically more of a narrative talk, which gives you some ideas on how do we really address these issues of equity when we look at the demographic changes. Okay, so as I told you, why we are concerned about it? We are concerned about it because we have been taught that the population growth is something which is leading to poverty, which is leading to inequity, all the inequality. These are all we are well known for us. Because that is what I told you, if you are an economic students or the students of social sciences, because this is what has been taught to us. Population growth is not really advisable because primarily, even in India, why it is so? Because most of our estimations, primarily, if you really want to, most of our inequality estimation is based on NSSO data you are aware of. The NSSO data gives you household level consumption and it's a per capita consumption. Naturally, once you take per capita, any households which has large number of children or large number of the people will have less in their per capita income. So naturally, this household size becomes so vital in actually ensuring that your poverty level, your inequality level, all those things really matters. So that's why, there were two arguments. But some people say, it's actually the poverty that breeds all these things because, and there are been people were arguing the other way, population-based poverty. Once you have large number of children, naturally the household will be poverty. Although these debates are complex, but still, I'm saying there is a large understanding that the large household size, there is a possibility that the per capita household expenditure will be low naturally, and there will be poverty and also inequality, all those things across households compared with the smaller households. And per capita income and household welfare due to family size has been widely discussed, and there has been quite a number of papers on this in the past. So naturally, that was the pure justification for the small family size, and there is also a need for introducing a family planning program, and all those things primarily came from all these kinds of understanding. So, but as all of us know, inequality is one of the most discussed issue all over the world, not only in terms of the demographic changes, but in all fields. So naturally, when you venture into this field, you also need to understand the scholarship in this field is really vast. So, and it is so difficult really to get into all these things. So that's what I have to really tell you that, I will be perhaps addressing a very minute part of it, not really the inequality literature in itself, because it is vast. So what is our expectation? Let us also look at what would have been we expect within the fertility transition. Definitely, as I told you, because of the household per capita income, we would have expected more economic inequality existing, more economic equity existing with the fertility transition. With the fertility transition, the equity, I don't mean the state level equity or anything. It is across households within a region. Why actually there should be equality, more equality? Because the household size becomes, suppose assuming that everyone has only 2 children. So in case all the households in that region has only 2 children, so naturally your household size more or less may be same. It depends on the parents or the joint families, etc. Otherwise, the household size will be same. So naturally, the inequity is definitely only because of the income, not because of the per capita part of it. So naturally, you would expect that there will be more household equity existing. And also, we would also expect more health equity in the demographic changes. Also, all of you know there is more convergence in most of the MCH and other indicators, whether it is in the mortality, infant mortality rate, whether the child loss across households, or whether it is the receiving antenatal care or the vaccination and all those things. That there's a convergence always happens in the course of this transition. So naturally, you would expect more of a health equity, although there can be inequity in some aspect of the health. But in general, we would expect that there is more health equity. There is also argument that there will be more educational equity, because one of the major aspects of the fertility transition is that, the aspiration about the children will go up, especially among the parents. So parents will have intense desire to educate their children because, one or two children. So naturally, education gets precedence over all other things within the households. So naturally, there will be more educational equity once you look at education across the different classes or even across gender or different things. You would also see a convergence in that. Not a perfect convergence, but it's more towards equity. Otherwise, in the past, that majority of the people were illiterate or some of them were very educated. It was the case. So those cases can really substantially come down with the demographic changes. And we also know that there can be more gender equity because, as it's mentioned, the purpose of introducing a family planning program in the Western countries, when it was introduced. So it's not a family planning program, it was a birth control program at that time. So it was primarily because they thought that the birth control will give more gender equity, not really because of the population control program. Population control's rationale for the family planning program or the birth control program came much later, like when India, etc., introduced. Otherwise, for the developed countries, it was really the gender equity was the major reasons for the birth control program, introduction of the birth control program. So naturally, one would expect there will be more gender equity, which is happening along with the demographic changes. So this is all what we expect. So in the equity side, we are expecting a very positive side as we move on in the demographic transition process. So question is that, is it really happening, or is it the equity which is really driving due to the demographic changes? Because we know that the transition is really taking place almost in most of the countries, especially in India now. So what we know about demographic dividend and equity, we know that, once you look at the dividend aspect, demographic dividend specifically, if you come, we know there is only limited attention to it. No one really talked about the equity aspects in the dividend. Dividend is primarily looking at whether actually a fertility change or the demographic change can really lead to, or the boom in the working age population can lead to an economic growth. That is what primarily it was a economic growth concept, not really an equity concept. So that way, there has been only very, very limited attention really to understand what would be the effect of demographic equity in the context of demographic dividend. There has been hardly any attempt. There has been not that no attempt is there. If you really look at the national transfer account, that's another way of understanding the demographic or understanding or estimating demographic dividend. If you're not aware of national transfer account, it is one of the major research program has been implemented really to understand the age effect of national income. So actually distributing national income across ages so that you will primarily know who is creating national income, who is consuming national income, and all those things. So that was an attempt which will give a perfect idea about what is demographic dividend is all about. So there is a website for this national transfer account. If you want more interested, you can really look at it. But this has been a concern for the NTA because NTA looks at actually how the transfer happens between older generation to adult generation to younger generation. All those transfers, these estimates. So the question was that whose transfer? I'm saying, transfer with a one or two billionaire can really make the huge transfer. You can say that, if there are most of the billionaires in the world are really 60 and above, you might also see that there is a lot of transfer taking place from the older ages to the younger ages in the national income. But, that is because of the inequity persisting in a particular region. So that doesn't give much idea about what is the transfer system between older ages to adult ages or between the reverse part of it. So naturally, the question was that how do you really adjust for the inequity? There has been some attempt to it, whether it is the gender adjustment or whether it is the economic inequality adjustment. But, I will also show you that result, but it is all of it has its own limitation because most of the classical inequality analysis will give you some understanding, but it cannot go beyond a level. So naturally, we are also about to stop there. So what's the challenges? So I believe that there are two challenges as an young scholars, you need to be aware of it. There is something called a conceptual challenge that is very, very important. Question is that what is the equity in the course of demographic change, whether it is economic aspects or other equity? How do you really understand it? Is it understanding equity in the classical sense of inequality, because you have the classical measures, all those things are there. So through that way, can we understand it? Or really need to look at in a differently? That is one aspect of the major challenge. And second, definitely is the methodological challenges. As I told you, you can always adjust, make measurement by adjusting for inequality. It's always easy because you have standard measures, whether it is the variations or the standard deviations or whether it is the advanced measures like Gini or all those things you can really make, compute and then adjust for it, and then you can also get a measure out of it. So, but is it that, will that give you an idea about it? So I'm going to look at both these aspects to a minor extent, really giving the demographic dividend as an example, and then provide how do we really go ahead further on research on these issues. That is my today's focus. So let me also clarify that, my lecture is not an attempt to look into all forms of demographic and health inequality. So one should not expect that. And also, I am also not looking at a wider dimension. As I told you, I'm only looking at a very minor dimension, which is the demographic dividend aspect today. And perhaps the first part of it, I will also say something about the demographic changes in India. And then we'll look at specifically into demographic dividend estimations and then really see how one should understand the equity within that. And then finally, I will also give some conclusions on that. So I don't want to get into more on the demographic changes aspect. But, to tell that, the patterns of demographic changes, the patterns of the fertility transition in these countries, especially in South Asia or many countries of the developing countries, has been systematically and significantly different from what we experience from the experience of Western countries. So naturally, we need to be aware of when we talk about demographic dividend, when we talk about the implications of dividend in terms of the growth or equity, all those things, we really need to be very aware of that. Because the classical understanding that is the negative correlation which is widely recognized between any measures of development and a measure of the demographic changes or the fertility transition, which is often questioned in the case of many of these countries. You know that many of these countries have entered into the fertility transition without adequate human development progress or the overall development or the other development. So naturally, there is socioeconomic changes perhaps is not preceded the fertility transition in this country. So we have a different kind of the environment within the context of a fertility transition, not actually the context is entirely different. So we also need to be aware, and when we really adopt the other concept and methodology, etc., in the case of India and that matter, any of the South Asian countries or other developing countries. So we know about the fertility transition. So this is highly optimistic kind of picture is now perhaps is given because we know that the fertility has already reached the replacement level in India, even 2020 or even before, as some people argue, and it is likely to be continuous. So naturally, there is a large optimism on what is really happening within the context of India on fertility transition. So as I told you, the household size has considerably come down. If you really look at over a long period of time, the household size, which was almost at the peak in the 80s and early 90s or 70s, 80s and 90s, which was systematically came down. It has now almost reached 4.5 and it perhaps is much lower now because with the fertility transition accelerated, the household size has come down. That's what I told you. Any estimates of per capita now, you would perhaps get you much higher kind of income and much higher levels of consumption simply because there is a fertility transition which is taking place, not because even not necessarily that your consumption has to increase, your income has to increase, but simply because of the average household size, you would also see an enhancement in the consumption and income, etc., in any country now. So this is what I have been mentioning because, the fertility transition in India did not really proceed with a high levels of economic development or the high levels of even social development, because that was the classical pattern one would have expected the demographic changes to take place. But that was not the case because, if you really look at what was the per capita income when a particular state in the country started their fertility transition, also achieved their fertility replacement level fertility, like in Kerala, it was very, very low. Kerala has never been a very highly economically advanced state, and that's the case with even Tamil Nadu to some extent, Andhra, etc., Himachal Pradesh, and even that matter Odisha, all those states, it is to a major extent. So that way, we don't expect that the context of what we experience in the developed countries or the global north, you can say it will be applicable to our countries. This is also the case with the education, because that was the second important factor, which is always considered the critical factor, the female education, the women's education, which is the most important factor which will determine the fertility transition, which is also, you'd say, varied patterns in India. You can see even illiterate has very low fertility in some parts of the country, but illiterate has very high fertility in some other parts of the country. But you don't see a real pattern which is a standard pattern which we observed in many other countries of the world. So now I don't want to spend much time on that. This is only a context. So let us come back to the demographic dividend and then see what is the concepts of equity in the context of demographic dividend. There is large optimism among everyone that, since India has a rapid fertility transition and our age structure is changing. And with majority of the people, majority of the population in the adult age group now, almost 60 to 65% of the population in the adult age group, in the working age group, everyone expects there is a positive, the demographic dividend. At least there is a potential positive demographic dividend. But at the same time, all of us know that, if you really look at the popular writing, if not popular writing, even the scholarly writing in India, and no one expects that there is a considerable advantage for in India because of the demographic dividend. Everyone really doubt or suspect what would be the effect of these demographic changes of fertility transition with the demographic dividend. I think there are perhaps two or three concerns on it. One is, the timing of demographic dividend, because everyone knows there is a serious heterogeneity in India, because some states has achieved fertility transition, some states is far away from that. So naturally, there is heterogeneity and the timing, etc., is significantly different across states in India. So that could be state level differences can also affect the country as a whole. And then there is also concern about the causal linkages between demographic change and dividend, because people say what is dividend in India? Because there is a lack of education for the majority of the adult population here, lack of skill levels and higher levels of unemployment. When there is a high levels of unemployment, lack of skills, what kind of dividend we can expect? Although you may have a large proportion of people in the adult age group, if you are not able to be productively employed them, and if you are not able to give them adequate skill levels to get productively employed, then what is actually, that is what, if you really look at the scholarly writing, I think the second one, what was really dominating in the writing, I think the timing of demographic dividends, I don't think we need to really much tell, because there are a lot of ways of looking at the timing. So, but it is true that timing is also significantly different. There are some states who are yet to enter into the demographic dividend stage according to the estimates, if you really look at through a dependency ratio. But if you really look at through a support ratio, it is significantly different. So there are variations in it. But that is perhaps one of the reasons you might say that, okay, India, because of the serious heterogeneity across states, this can happen. And let's also look at the demographic dividend estimates. There are different ways of estimating demographic dividend. As I told you, the major ways of estimating people looked at through a panel data analysis. So over a period of time, really what is really happening to a demographic change and the economic growth. How far actually, what proportion of the economic growth can be really proportion to the demographic or fertility transition or the demographic changes because of the age structure changes. That is what it was really estimated, because age structure changes is primarily because of the fertility transition or the demographic changes. So naturally, one can say both these things together. So the other approaches, as I told you, NTA approach is there. All the three approaches are there. If you really look at any estimates of demographic dividend, the estimates which are based on very rigorous methodology and by making all the efforts really to adjust for the causality, the endogeneity, the real causality, all those things, with all these estimates, which we see a very positive result. And none of these estimates has really shown a negative effect of the population, the age structure on the economy. So, but as I told you, but this is not the case in the popular scholarly writing. The popular scholarly writing always considered, India is not going to enjoy the fruits of demographic dividend because of all the negative implications which is existing because of the negative aspects which is existing in this country. Whether it is unemployment, whether it is unskilled labor, whether it is uneducation, all uneducated people, all those things has been considered as the major reason. So one has to really understand why this happens. Why actually, when there is an estimate based on very scientific data with scientific methodology, which gives a very positive effect, and some of these estimates gives you as high as 20 to 30% effect of the economic growth because of the population transition, so the demographic changes. But at the same time, we really don't see. Even if you really look at the NTA methodology, as I told you, India has slightly using a different methodology altogether, because India has something called a first demographic dividend, which we usually estimates in the panel data analysis, and the second demographic dividend, which we see the demographic dividend becomes zero, it's only by the first demographic dividend, which is the pink line, which becomes zero only in 2039. So India is still enjoying even the first demographic dividend. And second demographic dividend, obviously, according to them, it will continue because that is actually even the age structure changes to the older ages. The NGA estimates that there will be dividend on it. So naturally, it will continue. But even the first demographic dividend in India is still on the face of demographic dividend. And there is, but India estimates are also future projections. So that one can say, okay, there can be issues. But many of these estimates, which we see on, these are basically based on what is actually happened or the data which has already the economic growth and the real data. So the real data which we really see that there is a real progress towards the. So the question is that why there is this disconnect, and how do we actually explain this disconnect between the real estimates of the demographic dividend and also writing on this, particularly in the case of India. And I'm sure this is the case with many of these even South Asian countries. So perhaps the question what we have to ask is it because of the inequity existing in the country? So why? Primarily because many of these estimates, as I told you, it is only a growth. Once you say that it's only an economic growth, it can be a growth of a few people. It can be a growth of the rich sections of the population. It may not necessarily be because of the demographic, the real changes which is happening in the society in terms of the small family size or the transition which is happening because of the demographic changes. So what is actually, whether equity or inequity can explain this? So one possibility is that, as I told you, you really look at what we call an inequity adjusted the measure. So this is what actually Narayana has done on the NTA. What they have done, they have adjusted for inequality in the NGA measure for the first demographic dividend in India. So if you really look at, you would say that definitely once you adjust for the inequality, you would see that, the extent of dividend will be slightly lower. Naturally, I think it is, as I told you, it is ending at 2038 or something. So it may be slightly lower in case of the proportion of the growth which happens because of the demographic dividend. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's a substantial dividend still exists, even after adjusting for inequality. So the traditional way of adjusting inequality provides you some idea. Okay, you will say that, okay, earlier it was 30% of the 30% of the growth could be apportioned to the demographic changes. Now it is okay, it's only 25%. No, naturally, it might come down. So that is fine. So other than that, it doesn't really give you an idea why actually there is a discrepancy between these two. So I think that is why actually one has to really go beyond C and then see how do you really understand demographic dividend. So what I am going to do now, I know we can really look at the dividend in a different ways. The one possibility of looking at dividend is that actually looking at what really is a dividend. We know how actually the pathways of achieving a dividend in the course of the fertility change, in the course of the age structure changes. So if you really look at the Bloom and the Williams papers, so the Bloom and the other paper, sorry. And they have thought that, what are the facilitating or the pathways of achieving the dividend? Because the fertility transition can give you 2 or 3 major advantages. Now, as I told you, what is the first of the major advantages is that the fertility transition can really directly leads to the work participation of the women in any society. Because the women who are spending their time primarily for childbearing and child rearing, now actually is able to come to the labor market, and that can really enhance the labor force participation. And for the household welfare, that earlier only one person was working, now the 2 of them are working. And even in the per capita concept, the number of children are less. Naturally, that will give you a really good dividend. So, and the second one is that, there will be household saving will be much higher, because when you have less number of children, naturally there is high possibility that the household can really save much more than in the past, because otherwise they were spending much of their money on the children's well-being, especially for their education, for their food, their clothing, and all those things. So in all this respect, they say that, there can be a higher dividend, which can really advance the household status, household economic status. Naturally, if you consider all these things, this is also a concept which can really directly lead to some extent to the equity, if it is not the equity in all sense, but the economic status of the households can really go up systematically. And also they say, okay, there can be a resource allocation, a reallocation of resources, not allocation, but reallocation of resources from children to the physical capital, because this is the concept of the colon, the earlier concept, when actually when there is less number of children, you can really reallocate the government resources, etc., more from investing in children than investing in physical capital. So naturally, once you invest in physical capital, there will be more employment generation, there will be more investment, savings, and all those things happen. So naturally, there will spiraling effect on the economy. So that is perhaps they say the behavioral effect, which is the major part of the changes which is happening. There is also an accounting part which they say, which we can ignore, which is not very important because that is something automatic which is happens, whether because of swelling itself can have some benefits or because of the high life expectancy increase can have some benefits. All those things are something automatic which happens, but otherwise behavioral law, because of the changes in the society, this is actually three major aspects. But if you really look at these two, what is really happening, whether the household saving in India has really responded to it, we will say that, to some extent, in the earlier years, we see 80s, etc., when the fertility transition has happened, which we see some effect, but thereafter, we really don't see much of the effect. So we will only get a mixed picture on that. So in that case, it's a serious question to ask. Where is actually, what is the effect of? Is it because of the equity within the in a household setting, or with inequality which is existing, a serious inequality which is existing in a country, even within despite the demographic changes which is really happening, this lack of much the responding of the saving rate because of the demographic changes. And anyway, I don't really need to go much deeper into what is really happening on the women's employment in India, because that has been widely discussed, and also is all the economic students definitely know much about it. And we know that it has never responded. It has not only that it has responded, if you really look at the state level, the states which has even lower fertility, and many of the states which has very lower fertility also has accompanied by a very low participation of the women. So there is no correspondence at all between the low fertility in India and also women's workforce participation. That we really don't see much interlinkages between these. So how do you understand all those things? So what do we really make out of all those things? So let me just go to this one. So I'm saying that, there is no fact that all empirical investigation really tells you on demographic dividend. As I told you, you can have estimate demographic dividend, but you can also adjust the estimates with inequality estimates, or you can have the direct estimation is also possible because of demographic changes with some inequality measures also we can estimate if you have a good panel data. So, but all these things, if you really say estimates, which we give you some result, but which many of the scholarly writings of scholars in our country or many countries of South Asia doesn't trust about it. So although we say that there is a dividend, but they think that no, it's really dividend, because if you really know most of the popular writing on this, it is always tell that demographic dividend in India is positively negative. That is what the writings many often is argue that. So there are three important points we really need to measure. Perhaps the traditional ways of measuring and adjusting inequality have its own limitations. That is what, we can always adjust it by some inequality measures, but that perhaps is not going to give you much of an understanding about what is this relationship. Perhaps then what is the other way? One possibility is that, we really need to really understand the pathways of it, because, if you have to have an economic advancement and improvement in the standard of living at the household level, because we are not looking at a interstate comparison across households. If you really want to understand what is household level, we really need to also understand what really affects the households because of certain changes, whether it is the societal changes, whether it is the demographic changes, we need to really look at the pathways. Actually, perhaps the inequality analysis has to be done on the pathways rather than on the aggregate. Because once we really do the inequity analysis at the aggregate, we often see some result. We know, as I told you, we can always adjust and we can really reduce the effect, but that really doesn't really give a better understanding of what is really happening because of. So perhaps in many of these issues, how we really do analysis, how we do understand these things, perhaps we really need to change. So, but what is more important in that case, is the conceptual clarity. Conceptual clarity in the sense that what are the pathways through which certain changes are happening, certain changes can really affect on the particular households or particular individuals, and all those things become much more important when we really look at an equity analysis. As I told you, I will now stop. This is also a case with, because demographic changes or demographic dividend is only one case of such a issue. But as we told, demographic changes has a wide variety of issues, whether it is a gender aspect, whether it is educational equity, whether it is population aging, because some people argue that what is a major inequity which is going to come out because of the population aging, of the major transition is the widowhood and its effect on the inequity within the households or between across individuals and all those things. So all those things are really a major issues which we are going to be confronted with the major changes which is happening. So it is actually for the young scholars like all of you, I think this is such an important area. One has to really understand the pathways of it. If there is a demographic changes, what are the pathways through which a gender equity can be ensured or gender equity can be affected? So this is also a case with many other aspects which we really deal on these issues. So let me finally conclude. So as I told you, evaluation of inequality within demographic changes is very important, because currently what we are really doing is much on the growth rate of it, what is its impact on the development, what is the impact on the growth and all those things. But there's hardly much analysis on the inequity or equity aspects of demographic changes. However, as I told you, the approach needs more of a conceptual and methodological clarity. So perhaps, we really need to go much more beyond what the classical way of analyzing an inequality or classical way of understanding the inequity when we take an issue like demographic changes. So not that, traditional approaches are not important. They perhaps cannot give you a full understanding. That's all. It can definitely give you some understanding, but it cannot really reveal what is actually, perhaps when there are issues like this happens, when there is scholars telling that there is no demographic dividend, but estimates tell there is demographic dividend. One really need to unpack why such issues happens in the context of countries like India. So that's why there is a need for more innovative approaches and more better measures of inequality. And also, I think demographers perhaps and economists can really join together, and they will be in a better position to undertake such kind of analysis. Thank you so much. I look forward to our meaningful discussion, because as I told you, my paper was really not on any estimates or anything, only just throwing some ideas, so that you will perhaps learn much more from you rather than from my talk as such. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for inspiring our members to look at demographic change through a equity lens. We'll open up for questions without wasting much time.
Yeah, so we'll take a question from the participant, and would request the participant to raise hand so that we can then ask you to unmute and ask a question. So yeah, we'll start with the questionnaire session. Or if anyone can unmute and just introduce them and ask the question.
While others are thinking about the question, I probably can start with one of the thoughts that you had raised in one of your earlier writings or talks, that about the household expenditure structure itself, where the traditional surveys look at, they go to the household, collect the number of members, their details, but where the highest expenditure often is for the children who are not really living in the household. So probably that is one pathway that you raised towards the end of your talk. That's probably a pathway of discrepancy or inequality in household consumption versus household income. I mean, more thoughts on this probably you can give me.
Yeah, yeah, that was not directly connected with this, but it is very important because when we measure something at the household level, because the issue is primarily comes because of the large scale migration which is happening nowadays, and especially the migration because of for the educational purpose. And most of these parents are really spending much of their resources for the educating their children, and many of these children are educated outside from they are living outside India, perhaps, or outside the state, or outside in different cities. But when we come and measure the household size, we don't measure them, but much of their expenditure of the households may be going for them. So that is why actually the migration really gives you a different issues on measuring, especially something at the household level. So that's why it was told that you may only see a two-member households when you go for a survey, but with a two-member household, the expenditure, if you really look at it, will be huge, substantial. One would say, how can a two-member households can really spend so much of money, because they're spending that money primarily because they are investing in their children. So these are complex issues. How do you really address a survey? That is what we thought, as survey also need to move from a household to family now, because as the demographic changes happens, it is more family become more important. Family is a very well-defined unit. Because household, that you can have a servant that's also part of the households. But family has a different definition. So these are all the innovation which we really need to happen in the course of in the measurement and also in the surveys and etc. Yeah, thank you for raising that question. Yes.
Yes, Satwik, you can go ahead.
Uh, Thank you, Professor James. Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot. I'm not a demographer, so I learned a lot more than the other demographer present here. My question is not directly about your presentation, but I'm tempted to ask you because I got you. How demographers are looking at when India will become eventually old, considering India's large informal labor participation, that means without any social security. Could you please direct me to some literature or guide me to begin thinking about this topic? How India will cope with the old uh, population without any social security? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no, there are different ways of looking at it. One is, as I told you, the demographic dividend group also looks at what is the impact of the older population on an economy or the country as a whole. That is what the national transfer account, if you can really go to the national transfer account website, you will get, there's a second demographic dividend. The second demographic dividend is primarily an estimate if a country become older, what would be its impact on the economy aspects. So that is how they really look at it. But otherwise, most of the studies on older people in India has been primarily looking at more of a, you can say, more in a vulnerability framework. What are the vulnerabilities actually older ages faces, whether it is in terms of social security, whether it is of the health burden, whether it is of the poverty burden, or in terms of other vulnerabilities, like as I told, the widowhood and so on and so forth. So there is large literature on this, which really brings out what could be the possible scenario when proportion of older people goes up, how it can really seriously affect, because we expect that family ties will come down. So naturally there could be not many families may not be able to take care of their parents. So in that cases, with migration of children happening, what would happen? social security system, especially the providing income security, has been widely talked about. But there is only very lack of sufficient progress in that direction. All of us know that in many states, it's there is no universal social security in any case in India. Even if it is there, it is only in a limited scale to only to the poor sections of the population, but that to a very limited amount. In some states are giving a relatively better amount, but otherwise it's a very relatively small amount. So these are the issues. This is, I think, it's not purely a demographic issues. It's done from all kinds of discipline. I think whether it is sociologist or whether economist, or there are attempts to estimate it, what is its burden. There are attempts to estimate what will be the disability burden because of the older ages and how actually it affects households and so on and so forth. All such attempts are there, both by economists and also by the demographers and even by sociologists and many other scholars. Yeah.
So may I?
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful lecture as well. So if I consider economy and demography, let's say as a cloak of a hand. So if the demography is our hand, which takes a lot of time to change, and economy is a minute hand, it's changing so fast. So how do I understand the household changes? If I see the, like you talked about the economic equity, like, so how do I see the relations of the changes in the household structure, as well as how it goes with the economic changes that I see it's happening so fast. However, household changes might not be so fast. So how do I increase or enhance my understanding on that? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Pasha, you are primarily asking a very serious methodological question, which even I don't have a really good answer to this. But that what you are perfectly correct. When you say that economy can really change faster sometimes, but demographic change cannot be faster. So it is a long-term thing. So most of the classical analysis, which if you really look at from the excellent papers by in 1988 by that Journal of Economic Literature, what is his name? Anyway, I forget his name, but all these things, they take a very long period of data and then really look at. So they don't really look at a short period of data. It's a very long period of data and then really look at why, whether it is because of demographic changes, which is. But the alternative ways of looking at it, that is what I was today more of emphasizing, is that you can really also look at what happens to a household with a larger family and household with a smaller family. So it can be even cross-sectional, but cross-section cannot give you a better idea. So the question is that a household with smaller families is there any definite advantage over a household with larger family in terms of whether it is economic progress, whether it is in gender equity, whether it is in the educational aspects, and so on and so forth. So that could be an alternative, but you have to control for several other factors in that case. Not that it is so easy. So which also gives you an idea about how actually demography changes, although it's a long-term changes for a country, but for a household, it need not be very long-term in that respect. So that can give you also an idea about it. So I'm saying, as a demographer, it's always a challenge. What way you can do really analysis? You can really go either way because, with the proliferation of the household data, many people take the second ways of looking at it because household data can really give a good idea about. That's why, as I told you, many estimates, whether it is older ages, whether it is disability affects your consumption pattern, disability, all those things are really based on household data. Although we say that unless you know the long-term pattern, it is difficult to understand all those things. But, it's also possible to get some idea about it. I know cross-section data, the repeated cross-section has its own disadvantages, but in the absence of a longitudinal data, this could be a better way of going ahead with it.
So did you mean the 1980 Gary Becker paper?
No, I was telling that population and development linkages. There is a 1988 Journal of
David
Economic
Lamb's
Literature.
demographic variables and demographic variables and economic growth. David Lamb's paper also.
David Lam is there as also. Yeah. Anyway, I'm saying there are a lot of papers on these linkages. Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir. This is Varsha.
Yeah. Tell me, Usha.
Hello, sir. This is very insightful lecture. Thank you for that. I have small, question that currently India, our country is going through the huge demographic potential we have currently in India, and we see that majority of youth population is existing in India, and many of them are are in higher education, but we see that many people, even though they are in higher education, if once they are trying to enter into the job market, they really face the problem. So it feels like our country is having with huge potential of this demographic dividend, which we can take the advantages of that. But if we look at this scenario that many people are suffering with the job things and all these things, so I feel like it really affects the overall economy. So what is your perspective on that?
And that is what precisely I was telling. That is the real problem with the estimation and when you are interpreting the estimation. Because that's what I know. Estimation, everything is telling very positive, but even the demographers like you believe that these estimations are really not correct because we are not able to take advantage of it because there is serious unemployment existing in this country. That is what I'm saying. Although most of these estimates at the aggregate level gives you something, but at the real level, when you really analyze it very seriously, many people suspect the result of these estimates. That is what it is. That is what, as I told you, many not only we suspect, there are many scholarly writings really think that India is not able to take advantage of because of the demographic changes. So we really need to see. It's our duty to really see why actually these kinds of disconnect happens between the estimates, which is actually demographers has developed or the economists has developed over a longer period of time, and which we thought all these estimates are robust, but now is being increasingly questioned. So it's actually our duty really to unpack the mystery behind all those things. That's what I told you. I only tell you one way of looking at it, but there are different ways one can really innovate and find out why actually these are really not connected now compared to what we would have expected in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, sir.
That's two hands.
Hi, Anmol. Yeah. Can we, Professor James, would it be okay if we take 2-3 questions together and address them?
Sure, yeah, please. Yeah, because it's already 1 hour. Yeah.
Yeah, Anmol, you can go ahead and ask a question. Then Ashita, you can raise your question.
Hello, sir. Thank you for this lecture. I had a question about in the beginning you mentioned about the heterogeneity between states in the demographic development. The heterogeneity of states. I just wanted to ask how big of a problem does the heterogeneity between states pose in our ability to take advantage of the demographic dividend, and how could we overcome this challenge? What do you think about that, sir?
Yeah. Next one, I will take Ashita's question also.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the lecture. So I wanted to ask in regarding the health inequity part. So like currently the focus is more on reproductive and child health programs in India. So with the demographic dividend, what do you think are the other health inequities that could arise? And like aging is one of them, like you mentioned. And also, how would you think the traditional approaches at a household level would be required to be changed to address this?
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
thank you. I think really two very important questions are, but the really tough questions. One is how the heterogeneity can really affect the demographic dividend. If you assume that demographic changes is something which will really positively affect the economic growth or the equity aspects. Naturally, any heterogeneity is not advisable. I'm saying any heterogeneity means that some section of the population is really not really able to enjoy the fruits of the demographic dividend. So naturally, it will have an effect on the estimation. And estimation in the sense, because most of these estimates we are doing at the final data, it's really looking at the variations and then really estimating. So that way we are really looking at a state with not having a demographic changes, with the demographic changes, what is really its impact on the economic changes or economic growth. That is what we are estimating, and that's how we estimate the real effect of demographic changes. So naturally, no, but overall, if you are really looking at a well-being perspective, definitely it will have an impact. There is no doubt about it. And how, so it is, we expect that. But now, present, as I told you, most states are really undergoing a very rapid fertility transition. So naturally, we expect that most of these states will also get into the demographic changes or the demographic dividend era very soon, because even the states like Bihar is also now fast changing fertilities. So that way, everything is very optimistic now compared to the past, which was a very pessimistic picture a few decades back. And this second is, the question was the current reproductive health, the inequity, and in the future, what would happen on the health or aging and the various aspects. Yeah, that we definitely see. I'm saying, as I told you, we see more of a convergence in or equity in the case of many of the reproductive health indicators. That's what, especially in the case of healthcare provision, whether it is immunization, whether it is other aspects of it, not in all, but at least in many of these things. There are large concerns on the nutritional aspects, undernutrition and all those things. There are large concerns, but otherwise we see more of a equity in that. But with the demographic changes, definitely new forms of inequity going to emerge. And aging itself, as I told you, is a potential. And there are large literature in the Western countries on what is really happening, the inequity within the household level, etc., primarily because of the second demographic transition, which we call, because the family system collapses and there are a lot of other major individualism develop, and there are various challenges because of that. These are all has its own impact on the equity aspects. So this, I have not touched that aspects of the equity because that has a different dimension altogether. So we were really looking at primarily more of in the economic aspects or more in the dimensions which we often study, like education, health, and the gender, these aspects. So in these aspects, definitely at the older ages, as I told you, the widowhood and all those things will become a major challenges in a country where these issues. So those transformation has not really happened before the demographic changes, because in many other countries, demographic changes happen when after much of the gender equity, etc., took place. So here it is not that case. So naturally, we might see much of inequity existing in various other forms, even with the demographic changes, which we need to be aware of it. Okay, I think I will stop here.
Okay. Is there anyone, if Professor James, you have time to make for 5-10 minutes, or would like to close the
Yeah,
session?
I'm fine with it. I don't have any
Okay.
issues.
Okay. If anyone else have any question, please you can raise your hand or ask a question. I have one question for Professor James. So my question is that one is when you talk about demographic dividend, one of the thing is that what's the government policies and how government is looking at it. So taking the current budget which has just came out, and also would you how do you see the role of budget in enhancing the demographic dividend? Like one of the thing that we see that this time there was an internship program, one is skill labor which we talk about, and to achieve that we need that, and how you see the role of policies in currently, if what kind of policies what's our expectation in context of policies to like enjoy the fruit of demographic dividend and going forward, and how is the current thing, like helping us?
I'm saying policy definitely, because if you really look at most of the research papers which has estimated demographic dividend or many of these papers, finally they say that, ultimately all these things also depends on what is the policy adaptation to the demographic changes. That is really very, very important. So there's no doubt about it. So dividend definitely, I think whether that is why many people always have this criticism for various governments, because everyone thinks that the job creation and all those things has a direct connection with the policies and programs which the governments also undertake. So naturally, it has a direct connection. And I'm not don't know much to talk about the current budget, because there are different versions of it, because there's some people say that, because most of it is which has announced is already what is something existing. So you have internship is not that internship is not existing in this country. Internship already there, so it is already subsidizing the the agencies which is really providing internship now. So that way, I'm saying there can be some positive benefits, but as a whole, how far it can really help the employment creation, we really need to wait and see.
Yeah. Maradhwaj, over to you.
Maradhwaj is not audible from your side.
Hello.
Yeah,
Can you
now
hear
it's
me
fine.
now? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for an thoughtful presentation. I want to have your comment. Maybe it may not be relevant, but it also connected with the previous question. So I want to have your comment on the quality of population, basically in terms of education and health. So in India, I think during the last few decades, there was I think large educational transition happened, but that quality of education is still remain a concern. And other than about the health, so as per my understanding, I think for the demographic transition, adults are very important. So if we see in India that adults' health status is very poor, while we compare with that most populous country, like second most populous country, China, their China health status was better. China health status was better than India. That current, I mean, better was in 1998 or around 95. That India have currently now. So how that I mean that quality of adults especially can have impact on the demographic dividend. And second question, uh, so like you mentioned that India demographic transition is totally different than the Western world. So I want to link it with the urbanization. So compared to the Western country where urbanization was, I mean that the percentage of urban population was larger than India, and India urbanization, I think the process of urbanization is very slow compared to the other countries. So because the composition between urban and rural composition is totally different. That's because of the structural. Sorry, I mean the structural difference is totally different between the rural and urban area. So how do you think that India still have the large proportion of the rural population? How it will, I mean, how it will negatively impacting the demographic dividend in India? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. There are different questions on it. One was first asking about the quality of education and also the quality of health, which how can really affect the demographic dividend or whatever it be. The after coming here, I really found that the concern of quality of education is almost universal in nature, not only even in India. Even here, this is a major discussion. Even in the US, especially the quality of school education and all those things, there's a lot of discussion. Because most often what happens is that the companies which really recruit people, they skill them. That's how I think universally what happens. Because most often the education, the classic education which we get from the universities or from other places is not really sufficient for it will not really directly link to, no education system can really directly link to the demand in that respect. Because when you really enter into a company, their demands are their requirements are different, so naturally they will skill you. That is how actually the system works. So I'm saying not that the quality is not important. Quality of education, there is more things to be cherished in India. But at the same time, the lack of opportunities, lack of employment needs to be addressed very seriously. That I don't think that there is directly linked to the quality of education. So there is a serious problem with employment creation and lack of employment in our country. That is definitely true. And the healthy population is definitely, I'm saying, what is actually, especially when the transition process happens, you need to have adequately healthy population. And what is a measure of looking at? One of the best measures is normally life expectancy, which is really growing faster in India. And also, you may say that, health adjusted life expectancy, we are relatively poor, because these are all also issues which is more promotive and also preventive health. It's not really, because EPI and non-communicable diseases has to come down, and it is the diagnostic, preventive and promotive health that is much more important than the curative care there. So naturally, those things, any country needs attention, and India needs much more attention. That there is absolutely no doubt about it. The next question is the urban-rural linkages and the issues. Some argue that actually we are very conservative in defining urban, because many of our rural areas as progressed not in the several decades back, in the last few decades, if you really look at many of the rural areas or many of the periphery of the urban areas, you can say, because even in Delhi, you have a certain proportion of the population who are rural in nature, as per the definition. But is it Delhi state is really urban or rural? If you ask, it's primarily rural areas, but sorry, urban areas. But at the same time, it's also a part is the definition. The urban rural is primarily the question of linkages between these two. Whether there is a direct linkages, because if you get the facilities which is in the rural areas, although definitionally you might define it as urban area, sorry, rural area, it may not necessarily fall under that category. So I don't think urban rural, as you rightly told, the proportion of agricultural workers and that issue, we know that there are too many people working in the agriculture, which is unproductive. Many of them are not really very, productivity is very low. These issues, it's definitely because that is primarily because of the lack of opportunities within the urban setting and move from the agriculture to the non-agricultural sectors. So these are primarily, ultimately, many of these are issues relating to employment and employment creation compared to the issues totally on quality or totally on urban-rural differences or even on the health aspects.
Do you have any more question? We'll just end in next 5 minutes, and we are already up by
I can
time.
just raise a point. I can just raise a point. So we had a monsoon school recently at Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. The YSA South Asia conducted this, and there was a couple of journalists, and then one a journalist raised this question that, so okay, we have a lot of demography work on the states, southern states, or these states with demographic advanced states on their fertility transition, etc. But there are these states that has a very substantially faster rate of fertility decline, and even states like West Bengal's fertility decline is not adequately discussed by demographers, is what the concern by the newspaper and journalists were taken up. So what would you respond to that?
Yeah, that is absolutely. I'm saying that once you take many issues, in India there is a need for much more intensive research on it. It's not only on the fertility transition, but there are a large number of other issues which we really need large scholars really to come up and study much more deeply on it. It's true about fertility transition, because the southern states has got much more importance, primarily because this was actually sort of a beginners of fertility transition. So naturally, there has been a huge interest on it, why it happened suddenly. And when it became a routine to many other states, I think most of other states, it has not been really adequately studied, and everyone thought, also almost same pattern is really continuing. So that way, but we don't know whether there is any specificity in these places. Not that there are no studies, there are studies, especially there are, I know that MPhil dissertation and PhD work in many of these. Some of this, it doesn't get published. So that way there are issues because many of these Mopsil universities, they don't emphasize publication as much as many of the better universities. So naturally, all those kinds of issues may be there. But and there is no doubt about it. There are so many demographic issues which need to be intensely studied and understood.
Okay, so if we don't have questions, so we'll end the session just with last question that I have. One is, Professor James, it's when you talk about equity concern in Indian context, there's a social equity or social inequality, that's caste. So in the context of demographic change and demographic dividend, how we place caste is one of my first question. Like, do we see changes in caste discrimination or equity or inequality concern with the caste? And the second is, like, if we are to place the demographic dividend issues of India in context to South Asia, our South Asian neighbors, so how do you place, or if you can just give us like how position we are in context of our South Asian neighbor? So that's my two question. Okay.
Yeah. Now, caste is a classical way of really studying the relationship between demographic changes and equity, especially the demographic dividend. Because, if you really look at many places there, I don't know, it is universally true. One, you would also see that the fertility transition has been relatively better among the lower caste, the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, etc., compared to many of the OBC caste. You would also see in at least some states. So, but if you really see the economic progress, how do you really rate it? That is what the overall estimates and the disconnection between what is really happening, the aggregate estimates and the reality within if you really look at several specific groups, etc., is sometimes is startling. So that's why it's so important to study many of these at a very micro sense and also in a specific group wise rather than really at the aggregate level. Aggregate level, once you look at, you would see these kinds of very positive things emerging. But that may not be sometimes the case when you really study. But there are very, very limited studies on such kind of specific groups on really looking at the changes and how one can really look at their economic advancement or overall well-being. What was your second question?
The second question is like putting the Indian demographic issue or dividend issue in the context of a South Asian neighbor. So how do we see our South Asian neighbor and how well placed they are and how we are in Indian context? So what's the challenge, and if you
Yeah, no, in South Asia, most of the states in South Asia has been also, even along with India, has been experiencing a rapid fertility transition, except perhaps the Pakistan has been an exception to some extent in the earlier years. But now even Pakistan is also rapidly coming into a demographic fertility transition stages. So that way, but there is much common in South Asia rather than much of a differences. You can say that the timing has been slightly different in different countries because Sri Lanka has been much earlier compared to many other countries. But there is, I'm saying, in the context also has been much more similar in most countries of South Asia. Whether it is, most of these countries are experiencing not with a very high economic growth or social development or anything, except maybe for Sri Lanka, which has a different pattern. Otherwise, it is very similar in most of the South Asian countries. So that way, there is much more common in South Asia. One can really study them in one basket, really looking at much of the variation within these baskets, what's really happening. So that is really an advantage. So South Asia, the South Asian scholars, many people say, don't collaborate each other much because many Indian scholars would be collaborating much more with the Western scholars rather than within South Asian scholars. So that is really the real problem. So that way we are not able to have a uniform study within the South Asian countries, many of them. And most of the South Asian study, in case it takes place, takes place in the Western countries rather than within South Asian countries. That is also another issue.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll close the session, Arun.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That is a wonderful final point to end the session. But thank you so much for taking time with us and taking a lot of time actually. And sorry for the technical glitch that happened in between. And thanks to all of you for joining from different parts of the world. Keep an eye on this particular webinar series on demographic economics. We have new speakers coming up lined up in the coming months. So from the side of South Asia Working Group and from YSI, I would like to thank Professor James again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
So
Prof.
yeah,
K.S.